When I came back from a short trip, I expected to see my garden full of fresh flowers, ripe tomatoes, and the little patch of sunflowers my daughter had planted before school ended. Instead, what I found made my jaw drop. The soil was bare, the plants gone, and the wooden garden bed I built with my own hands had been ripped out like it never existed. At first, I thought it might have been a mistake, maybe some kind of storm cleanup. But then, tucked under my doormat, was a smug little note from the HOA president Karen. She had decided my garden didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic and ordered it removed while I was away. I felt rage bubbling inside me, but little did Karen know that her careless power trip would soon backfire. When the state got involved, it wasn't me who paid the price. It wasn't me who paid the price. It was her asterisk when I first moved into that quiet suburban neighborhood. I thought I had found the perfect place to settle down. The houses were tidy, the lawns trimmed, and the streets lined with tall maple trees that cast soft shade on summer afternoons. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, the kind of neighborhood where people waved at each other as they pulled into their driveways and kids played hopscotch on the sidewalks. I bought the small 3-bedroom house at the end of the cul-de-sac with a dream in mind, building a home where my daughter and I could live simply, surrounded by little things that brought joy. For me, that joy came in the form of a garden. I had always loved gardening. My father had taught me when I was a boy, showing me how to dig neat rows in the soil, how to cover seeds just right, and how to wait patiently for life to sprout. He told me gardening was a lesson in hope. Every seed was a promise of tomorrow. That stuck with me, and when I had a daughter of my own, I wanted her to feel that same magic. The first week after moving in, I built 2 raised garden beds in the front yard and planted a mix of flowers, herbs, and vegetables. They weren't extravagant, just sturdy wooden boxes filled with rich soil, but they gave me something to work on in the evenings after long days. Soon, green shoots appeared, and the once empty patch of yard transformed into a lively spot buzzing with bees and butterflies. My daughter Emily loved it most of all. She was only 7, curious about everything, and she would race outside each morning with her little plastic watering can. Her favorite corner was the row of sunflowers. She had begged me to plant them, promising she would take care of them all by herself. Watching her face light up as the stems grew taller than she was, it was priceless. Neighbors passing by would smile and sometimes stop to compliment the garden. It added color to a street otherwise dominated by neatly clipped grass and identical shrubs. I thought everyone appreciated it. Everyone except Karen. Karen was the president of the Homeowners Association, a woman in her late 50s with a sharp bob haircut, perfectly ironed blouses, and a permanent scowl carved into her face. From the very beginning, I could tell she had made it her mission to control every square inch of the neighborhood. She was the kind of person who measured lawn height with a ruler and left notes on windshields if someone parked slightly crooked. She wasn't friendly, her smiles were tight, forced, and never reached her eyes. And when she saw my garden, she frowned like I had planted weeds across the entire yard. The first time she confronted me, it was early one Saturday morning. I was kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds, when her shadow stretched over me. I looked up to see her standing there with a clipboard in hand, pursing her lips. "You know," she said, her voice clipped and cold, "this isn't exactly within the HOA's guidelines." I wiped the sweat off my forehead. "It's just a small garden, nothing fancy." "A lot of neighbors have flower beds," she sniffed. "Yes, but front yard gardens like this disrupt the uniform appearance of our community. Everyone is expected to maintain grass, not farm plots." I chuckled, trying to keep it light. "It's hardly a farm, just some vegetables and flowers. My daughter loves it." Karen didn't laugh. She scribbled something on her clipboard and said, "Well, consider this a verbal notice. You might want to remove it before it becomes a problem." Then she marched away, heels clicking against the pavement. I shrugged it off at first. I had checked the HOA guidelines before planting, and nowhere did it say vegetable or flower beds were forbidden. As long as things were kept neat and maintained, there was no rule against it. Besides, I wasn't hurting anyone. So, I kept tending my garden, determined not to let one cranky neighbor ruin something that brought my family joy. Weeks passed, and the garden grew fuller, brighter. Emily's sunflowers reached halfway to the window, and every morning bees buzzed around the blossoms. I felt proud watching it thrive. But I noticed Karen watching, too. Whenever she walked her little terrier past my house, her eyes lingered on the garden, her mouth twitching like she had bitten into something sour. She never said anything directly, after that first confrontation, but I could feel her disapproval like a storm cloud over my yard. Then came the HOA meeting. It was held in the small community center near the entrance of the subdivision. Folding chairs were set up in rows and maybe 30 homeowners gathered inside, chatting quietly until Karen stood at the front with her clipboard. She called the meeting to order with a sharp rap on the table. "Before we move to budget items," she announced, scanning the room, "I'd like to address a matter of community appearance. Certain homeowners have begun altering the traditional aesthetic of our neighborhood in ways that may impact property values. For example," she gestured vaguely toward my end of the cul-de-sac, "front yard vegetable plots." All eyes turned toward me. I cleared my throat. "If you're referring to my garden, I'd like to point out that it's well maintained and actually adds to the beauty of the street. A man in the second row nodded. I walk by it every morning. It looks great. My kids love seeing the sunflowers. Another neighbor chimed in. It attracts butterflies. Better than staring at grass all day. Karen's smile was tight, her jaw rigid. While some may enjoy it, others may see it as disorderly. Our HOA strives for uniformity. Exceptions create problems. I raised my hand slightly. I reviewed the bylaws. There's no rule against gardens. As long as it's tidy, I'm within my rights. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's face flushed pink, but she moved on quickly to other topics, clearly frustrated that her attempt to shame me had backfired. That night, as Emily and I watered the plants together, I felt hopeful. Neighbors had spoken up in support, and I thought maybe Karen would finally back off. For a while, she did. She passed by with her dog, giving me nothing more than cold glares. I could live with that, but deep down I knew Karen wasn't the type to let things go. As summer approached, the garden flourished. Tomatoes ripened on the vine, marigolds bloomed in bursts of orange and yellow, and Emily's sunflowers towered proudly. She was so excited that she begged me to let her bring a few flowers to school for Shohan. Watching her stand in front of her class, holding those bright blossoms, I knew every ounce of effort in that garden was worth it. It wasn't just about plants, it was about memories, lessons, and the joy of creating something alive. Then came the trip. Work had sent me out of state for a week, and Emily stayed with her grandmother while I was gone. I watered the garden thoroughly before leaving, trusting it would be fine until we got back. I even thought, jokingly, that the plants might miss me. When I returned, though, what I found wasn't neglected, was destruction. The garden was gone. The wooden beds I had built were ripped out. The soil flattened, the flowers and vegetables torn away as if they had never existed. Only bare dirt could remain, scarred with tire tracks from whatever equipment had hauled it away. Emily ran ahead of me from the car, her eyes wide, and froze. "Daddy, where are my sunflowers?" she whispered. I couldn't answer. My chest tightened as I took in the emptiness, the silence where bees once hummed. Then I noticed the note tucked under our doormat, neatly folded, written in sharp, precise handwriting. "Your garden has been removed for violating HOA community standards. You are expected to reseed with grass immediately to restore uniformity. Karen, HOA president." I felt my blood boil. Not only had she destroyed something precious to us, but she had done it while I was gone, without warning, without permission. She had trespassed, uprooted, and erased months of effort in the name of uniformity. Emily tugged at my sleeve, her eyes wet with tears, and in that moment, my anger solidified into something sharper. Karen thought she had won. She thought she could bully me into conformity, but she didn't know the truth that my little garden wasn't just any garden. It was a certified pollinator habitat, registered with the state's environmental program, legally protected. By ripping it out, she hadn't just upset a homeowner. She had broken the law, and she was about to find out what that mistake would cost her. The night after I discovered the destruction of my garden, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment when Emily had asked me where her sunflowers were. That little patch of earth had meant so much to her. To both of us, it wasn't just plants, it was time we had shared, something we had created together. The fact that someone else had taken it upon themselves to erase it out of spite gnawed at me like a wound that wouldn't close. Karen's note sat on the kitchen counter. I must have read it 100 times. The arrogance in her words jumped out at me, that tone of authority she always used when trying to make others feel small. "You are expected to reseed with grass immediately," as if I was some unruly child she needed to discipline. She hadn't just crossed a line, she had bulldozed over it. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I walked outside the next morning to look at the damage again, hoping maybe I had overreacted the night before, but no. The beds were gone, completely, ripped from the ground. Even the soil looked stripped, like someone had scraped it clean. I crouched down, running my hands over the dirt, trying to find any sign of life. There was nothing. Emily wandered out in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes, and stood next to me in silence. She didn't cry this time, but the sadness in her expression to hit harder than tears. "I'll fix it," I told her softly. "I promise you, we'll get our garden back." That promise gave me resolve. After dropping Emily off at her grandmother's again, I sat at my desk and pulled out the folder with my garden's certification papers. A year ago I had applied for my little plot to be recognized as a pollinator habitat under a state program that encouraged residents to plant gardens for bees, butterflies, and other insects. It had taken some paperwork and an inspection, but eventually I had received the certificate and a small metal sign to post in my yard. That sign had been standing proudly among the flowers until Karen had it hauled away with everything else legally. The certification meant that my garden was protected. It wasn't just decorative landscaping. It was considered part of a state initiative, which meant destroying it without my permission wasn't a simple HOA matter. It was a violation of environmental regulations. And if I knew one thing about the state, it was that they took those protections very seriously. Still, I wasn't about to rush blindly. I started with the HOA board. I called the office number listed on our community bulletin and was directed to a generic voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation, asking them to call me back. Then I followed up with an email attaching a copy of my certification. I wanted to give them a chance to respond before I escalated. A day passed. Then two, no reply. On the third day, I attended another board meeting, determined to confront them face to face. The meeting room was smaller this time, only a handful of residents in attendance. Karen was there, of course, seated at the head of the table, her ever-present clipboard in hand. Her eyes narrowed the second I walked in. When the floor opened for homeowner concerns, I stood. I'd like to address the destruction of my front yard garden while I was away. It was removed without my permission. That garden was certified. Under a state pollinator program, it was legally protected. Karen rolled her eyes. As I explained in the notice, your so-called garden violated community standards. It was unsightly and disrupted the uniform appearance of our neighborhood. The board approved its removal. Excuse me, I said, my voice rising. You had no right to remove it. That was my private property, and I have documentation proving it's recognized by the state. Karen smirked, clearly enjoying the confrontation. The HOA's authority supersedes personal whims when it comes to maintaining the aesthetic of this neighborhood. If you have an issue, you can recede with grass like everyone else. End of discussion. The other board members avoided eye contact. One man shuffled his papers nervously, while another woman shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but none of them spoke up. It was clear Karen ran the board like a queen on her throne, and no one dared challenge her. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. This isn't the end of the discussion, I said evenly. You broke the law when you destroyed my certified garden. You'll be hearing from the state about this. Karen let out a short laugh, dismissive. Do what you like. The HOA has the final say here. Her confidence was staggering. Either she truly didn't know the law, or she was arrogant enough to believe it didn't apply to her. Either way, she had made a serious mistake. That night I filed a formal complaint with the state environmental office. I scanned and sent everything: the certification papers, before and after photos of the garden, the note from Karen, even a copy of the HOA bylaws that made no mention of front yard gardens being prohibited. The representative I spoke with on the phone was polite but firm. This is very serious, he said. Tampering with a certified pollinator habitat is a violation of state code. If what you're describing is accurate, the responsible party could face significant fines and be ordered to restore the property. Do you need me to identify who gave the order? I asked. Yes, the more documentation the better. A signed note would be very helpful. I almost laughed at the irony. Karen's arrogance had led her to leave that smug note, and now it was going to serve as evidence against her. I scanned it and attached it to my complaint. After sending everything off, I sat back in my chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time since I'd returned home, I felt a flicker of relief. This wasn't going to be another instance of Karen pushing her weight around unchecked. This time she had gone too far, and there were consequences beyond her control. Over the next few weeks I kept to myself. I reseeded a portion of the yard with grass just to keep it from looking barren, but I didn't rebuild the garden yet. I wanted to wait and see how the state responded. Karen, meanwhile, strutted through the neighborhood as smug as ever. Whenever she passed by my house, she gave me a thin, satisfied smile, as if daring me to challenge her authority. I didn't take the bait. I knew patience would serve me better. Then one afternoon, as I was unloading groceries from my car, I noticed a white sedan parked in front of Karen's house. Two men in suits stepped out, carrying briefcases. They walked briskly up her driveway and rang the bell. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see Karen's body language from where I stood, arms crossed, then hands flailing, then stomping her foot like a child throwing a tantrum. The men remained calm, handing her papers and speaking with measured authority. Finally, she snatched the documents from them, slammed the door, and disappeared inside. I knew exactly what had just happened. Later that week, an official letter arrived in my own mailbox. It was from the state's Department of Environmental Protection. They thanked me for bringing the violation to their attention, confirmed their investigation, and assured me that appropriate fines and restoration orders had been issued to the responsible party. Reading those words, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Karen had thought she was untouchable. She had believed her little fiefdom of the HOA gave her the power to dictate over everyone else. But now she was going to learn that there were higher authorities than her clipboard. And the best part, I hadn't had to raise my voice, throw a fit, or engage in her petty power games. I had simply used the law, and the law was on my side. That evening, I sat on the porch with Emily. She curled up beside me, holding a book we had been trying to read, though her eyes kept drifting toward the bare patch where her sunflowers once stood. "Daddy," she said softly, "will we ever have our garden again?" I smiled, ruffling her hair. "Oh yes, and this time, it'll be even bigger. We'll plant twice as many sunflowers, and no one will ever take them away again." Her face lit up with a hopeful grin. and in that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. This wasn't just about a garden, it was about standing up for what was ours. And soon, Karen would learn just how wrong she had been to cross that line. The morning the fine arrived, I wasn't even paying attention to Karen. I was busy fixing the squeaky hinge on my front gate when I noticed her at her mailbox. She usually carried herself with a stiff, confident air, as if she were surveying her kingdom. But that day something was different. She pulled out a thick envelope, frowned at the state seal stamped on the front, and tore it open right there on the sidewalk. I could see the color drain from her face even at a distance. Her mouth fell open, her eyes darted across the page, and then she clutched the letter in her hand like it was burning her fingers. For the first time since I had moved into that neighborhood, Karen looked powerless. She didn't notice me watching, but I saw the way her shoulders stiffened, the way she spun on her heel and stomped back into her house, slamming the door behind her. Later that day, I went to check my own mailbox. Inside was a letter from the Department of Environmental Protection. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, half expecting some bureaucratic dismissal. Instead, I read a carefully worded confirmation that my complaint had been validated. The state had investigated, found Karen responsible, and issued a fine. Along with a restoration order, they even included a direct line I could call if I needed further support in re-establishing the garden. For the first time since my return, I allowed myself a long, relieved breath. This wasn't just a small victory. Was the law on my side? Karen had thought her clipboard and her self-appointed authority gave her power over me. But now she had a higher authority to answer to. That evening, I sat with Emily on the porch swing. She leaned against me, swinging her legs idly. "Did you fix it, Daddy?" she asked. "Not yet," I told her gently. "But we will. The state says we can rebuild, and the person who took it down has to pay for what she did." Her eyes widened. "You mean Karen?" "Yes," I said simply. Emily's smile returned, small but real. "Good." She was mean. The following week, Karen tried to put on a brave face. She still marched around the neighborhood with her little terrier, but the usual smugness was gone. Instead, her walks were shorter, her pace quicker, and she avoided eye contact with most people. Word spread fast. In communities like ours, news traveled quicker than the morning paper, and soon whispers about the fine rippled down the block. I never told anyone outright, but neighbors started connecting the dots. They had seen my garden vanish, then seen Karen acting strangely, and finally heard bits and pieces about an official letter. By the end of the week, her perfect image as the all-powerful HOA president began to crack. One evening, as I was hauling in bags of soil I had just bought, my neighbor Jeff strolled over. He was a middle-aged man with a booming laugh and a love for barbecues. "Heard about what happened," he said in a low voice, smirking. "Karen finally get what's been coming to her." I raised an eyebrow, careful not to confirm too much. "Let's just say the state takes gardens seriously." Jeff chuckled, clapping me on the shoulder. "Good. She's been riding everyone for years. Last month she'll fine me for leaving my trash cans at the curb for an extra hour. An hour, glad to see someone finally put her in her place." It wasn't just Jeff. Over the next few days, more neighbors stopped by, offering quiet words of support. Mrs. Ramirez from across the street said Karen once threatened to ticket her because her grandson's bicycle had been left leaning against the garage door. Another neighbor admitted Karen had forced him to repaint his shutters twice because the shade of blue wasn't consistent with the community palette. The more I listened, the clearer it became. Karen had been ruling with fear for a long time, and people were tired of it. My situation had simply lit the spark that revealed her cracks. Still, Karen wasn't about to go down without a fight. A few nights after the fine arrived, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. I hadn't been planning to attend. I figured they would circle the wagons to protect her, but curiosity got the better of me. When I entered the small meeting room, the atmosphere was tense. Karen sat at the head of the table, the letter from the state spread out in front of her like a scarlet letter. Her face was pale, her lips tight. The other board members looked nervous, whispering among themselves before the meeting started. She cleared her throat and addressed the group. "As you may have heard, the state has issued a fine regarding the removal of a certain yard installation. I want to make it clear that this was an overreach. The HOA has the authority to enforce community standards, and the state has no business interfering." A man at the table, one of the quieter board members, spoke up timidly. "But Karen, the fine it's pretty steep, and it's in your name. The letter says you're personally liable, not the HOA." Her eyes flashed. "That's ridiculous. I was acting on behalf of the HOA. Therefore, the HOA should be responsible." Murmurs spread around the room. For the first time, I saw her control slipping. People weren't nodding along anymore. They were questioning, hesitating, doubting. I raised my hand. "With all due respect, Karen, the state's letter was clear. You signed the notice that authorized the removal. You personally directed the action. That's why it's in your name." Her glare could have cut glass. "You don't belong here. You've been nothing but trouble since you moved in." I kept my tone calm. "All I did was plant a garden with my daughter. You're the one who crossed the line." A silence fell over the room. For once, Karen didn't have a quick retort. She sat back, lips pressed tight, as if holding in the frustration boiling inside her. By the end of the meeting, no resolution was reached. But one thing was clear: the board wasn't willing to shoulder her burden. She was on her own. After that, Karen became even more isolated. She stopped waving at neighbors entirely. Her usual patrols of the neighborhood became rare, and when she did appear, she walked quickly, avoiding conversation. Some said they saw her arguing on the phone in her driveway, pacing back and forth with a letter in hand. Others claimed she had tried to convince the HOA's lawyer to intervene, only to be told there was nothing they could do. Meanwhile, I started planning the new garden. Emily and I sketched ideas on a notepad, deciding where the sunflowers would go, how many rows of tomatoes we wanted, and what flowers would line the edges. We even decided to add a small bench so we could sit among the blooms once everything grew back. It felt good to plan again, to look forward instead of dwelling on what had been lost. One Saturday morning, as I was unloading lumber for the new beds, Karen stormed across the street. Her terrier barked furiously at my feet while she waved a piece of paper in my face. "Do you realize what you've done?" she snapped. "Because of your complaint, I've been fined thousands of dollars. Thousands. This is harassment." I set the lumber down calmly. "Karen, you brought this on yourself. You destroyed a certified garden. The state isn't harassing you. They're holding you accountable." Her face twisted with fury. "You think you've won? You think this makes you some kind of hero? You'll regret this." I stood my ground. "The only thing I regret is that my daughter had to watch her garden disappear because of your arrogance. If you want someone to blame, look in the mirror." For a moment I thought she might explode, but instead, she spun on her heel, yanking her dog along, and stormed back to her house. From that day on, she never spoke directly to me again. The cracks in her power widened. At the next community barbecue, which she usually dominated, she didn't even show up. People laughed, kids played, and for the first time since I'd moved in, the event felt relaxed. Neighbors whispered that she was considering stepping down from the board, though no one knew for sure. As summer stretched on, the tension that had once defined the neighborhood began to ease. People were less afraid, more willing to speak openly. And every time I walked past the patch of dirt where my garden was being rebuilt, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice hadn't just been served for me, it had rippled outward, loosening Karen's grip on everyone else, and though she didn't know it yet, her downfall had only just begun. The first hammer strike on the new wooden frame felt like a turning point. For weeks my yard had been nothing but a patch of barren dirt, a daily reminder of what Karen had taken from me and Emily. But now, with fresh lumber laid out across the lawn and soil piled up in neat mounds, life was returning. The sun was high, warm on my shoulders as I worked, and every strike of the hammer echoed like a promise. We were rebuilding, stronger than before. Emily was beside me, bouncing with excitement. She wore her little gardening gloves, even though they were still slightly too big for her hands, and she was determined to help. Her job was to hold the packets of seeds and hand me nails when I needed them. Every so often, she'd pause to scribble in our notebook, sketching a messy outline of what she thought the garden should look like. In her drawing, sunflowers towered over the house, and rows of tomatoes stretched across the whole yard. "This one," she said proudly, holding up a packet of sunflower seeds, "goes in the front where everyone can see." "Exactly," I said, smiling. "We'll plant them right along the edge." Neighbors slowed down as they passed, some calling out encouragement, others even stopping to lend a hand. Jeff came over with his toolbox, insisting I borrow his power drill to save time. Mrs. Ramirez brought over lemonade and cookies for Emily, who sat cross-legged in the grass, sipping happily as she watched me work. The mood was different now. Where once Karen's presence had cast a shadow over the neighborhood, there was lightness, laughter, and cooperation. It felt as though rebuilding my garden had become a quiet act of defiance for the whole community. Karen, however, did not share in the cheer. I caught her watching from behind her curtains more than once, her silhouette barely visible as she peeked through the blinds. Occasionally she would step outside with her terrier, walking stiffly down the street, her lips pressed so tightly they were almost white. She never spoke to me directly again, but the message in her glares was clear. She resented every nail I drove into the wood, every bag of soil I poured, every seed packet I opened. To her, the garden wasn't just plants, it was a symbol of her defeat. As the garden began to take shape, I added something new. Along with the beds for vegetables and flowers, I built a small wooden bench under the maple tree by the sidewalk. It was nothing fancy, just sturdy planks, sanded smooth, but it gave the space a welcoming feel. Neighbors began stopping there, sitting for a few minutes while chatting with Emily or watching me plant. Kids rode their bikes up and down the street, pausing to look at the garden in progress, their eyes wide with excitement at the thought of seeing butterflies return. Emily, of course, was the most excited. Each morning before school, she would run outside to check on the soil, convinced the seeds would sprout overnight. I explained that it would take time, that patience was part of the magic. But she still knelt down, whispering encouragement into the dirt like the seeds could hear her. Watching her enthusiasm filled me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Meanwhile, whispers about Karen's find continued to spread. Though I never confirmed the details, everyone seemed to know that she had been personally held responsible. At the next HOA meeting, she tried to maintain her composure, but cracks were showing. Her once commanding tone was brittle, her arguments defensive. When the subject of community improvements came up, one board member asked pointedly, "Will this come out of HOA funds, or will this be like the garden situation?" Laughter rippled through the room, and Karen's face flushed crimson. For the first time, people weren't afraid to challenge her. That shift grew stronger each day. The grip she once had, the intimidation, the constant nitpicking, the endless threats of fines were slipping without the aura of authority she had wrapped around herself. She looked smaller, weaker. People began ignoring her petty notices, refusing to bow to her demands. She tried sending letters about parking violations and yard debris, but fewer and fewer people paid attention. One evening, Jeff leaned over my fence as I watered the new seedlings. "Did you hear?" he asked, lowering his voice. "There's talk about a petition to remove her as HOA president." I raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" he grinned. "Seriously. Folks are tired of her. Your situation just showed everyone that she's not invincible." I think this fine broke whatever spell she had over the neighborhood. The thought of Karen being forced to step down filled me with satisfaction, but I didn't let myself gloat. Instead, I focused on the garden, on nurturing what we had rebuilt. I wanted this to be about more than revenge. I wanted it to be about growth, resilience, and moving forward. Still, Karen couldn't let go. A week later, I came home from work to find a new note taped to my front door. The paper was wrinkled, the handwriting sharp and angry. "Your garden is once again in violation of HOA standards. This matter will not be dropped." I crumpled the note in my hand and laughed. It was desperate, hollow, an echo of a power she no longer had. Instead of tearing me down, it only strengthened my resolve. I walked straight to the yard, hammered the statute sign back into the soil at the garden's edge, and stepped back to admire it. The bold letters read, "Certified pollinator habitats protected by state law." If Karen wanted to fight again, she'd be fighting against the law, not just me. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest we'd had in a long time. Green shoots began pushing through the soil, and soon the yard was alive again. Tomatoes sprouted, marigolds bloomed, and Emily squealed with joy the morning she saw the first sunflower break through the dirt. She crouched down, hands on her knees, staring at it like it was a miracle. Double quotes. "See, Daddy," they listened. She said, "They're coming back." "Yes, they are," I said, smiling. Neighbors stopped more often now, some even bringing cuttings or seeds from their own gardens to share. Mrs. Ramirez gave me a handful of zinnia seeds, while Jeff dropped off some basil starters. Slowly, what had begun as one family's project became a community effort. The garden wasn't just mine anymore, it was ours. Karen, on the other hand, became a ghost. She attended fewer HOA meetings, and when she did, her voice was sharp but shaky. Her arguments brushed aside by others who had grown tired of her control. Rumors swirled that she was considering selling her house, though no one knew for sure whether she stayed or left. One thing was certain, her reign was over. One Saturday, as Emily and I sat on the bench beneath the maple tree, she leaned her head on my shoulder. "Daddy, it's even better than before." I looked out at the rows of green, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze, the bees buzzing happily among the blossoms. She was right, it was better. Not just because of the plants, but because of what they represented. The garden had survived destruction, defied arrogance, and returned stronger. It had united neighbors, broken Karen's grip, and reminded me that some battles are worth fighting, not with anger, but with persistence and patience. That night, as the sun set over the neighborhood, I thought about everything that had happened. Karen's fine, her humiliation, the way the community had rallied it, all seemed to converge on one truth. Power built on fear doesn't last, but roots planted in hope and care, those endure. And as I tucked Emily into bed, she whispered sleepily, "Tomorrow, can we plant more sunflowers?" I kissed her forehead. "As many as you want," because now, the garden was untouchable. The weeks following the state's involvement were unlike anything I had ever seen in my neighborhood. For years, Karen had strutted around like she owned every street, every driveway, and every square inch of yard. She thrived on control, wielding the HOA rules like weapons to cut down anyone who dared step out of line. But now, the balance of power had shifted. It wasn't me who was under the spotlight, it was her. And for once, the rules weren't her shield. They were the hammer that was about to fall on her. The morning the official state fine landed in Karen's mailbox, everything began to unravel. I was out front with my daughter, watering the small starter plants we had just put in the ground to rebuild our garden, when I saw her walk to the curb. She ripped the envelope open with her usual self-assured snap, her shoulders squared, chin lifted, but as her eyes darted across the letter, her entire body deflated. Her lips parted, and the color drained from her face. For the first time, I saw Karen speechless. She staggered back toward her house, clutching the paper like it was a snake about to bite her. My daughter, innocent as ever, asked if the mean lady was okay. I only shook my head. Karen wasn't okay. She was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who once stayed silent about Karen's antics suddenly wanted details. What was in the letter? How big was the fine? Did she really destroy something protected by the state? I didn't need to fuel the gossip. Karen's meltdown did it for me. She stormed around the street, shouting at anyone who would listen that it was all a misunderstanding. She knocked on doors, waving the letter and demanding sympathy. But sympathy was the one thing she couldn't buy or bully from the community anymore. For years, Karen had handed out fines for leaving trash cans out too long, scolded children for riding bikes on the sidewalk, and ordered people to repaint shutters because they weren't the approved shade of gray. Now seeing her stuck with a fine bigger than most people's yearly HOA dues, the neighborhood finally saw through her. People began avoiding her. Conversations stopped when she approached. Even her closest allies on the HOA board began keeping their distance. Meanwhile, I had my own work to do. The state officials who handled my pollinator garden case had been surprisingly supportive. They didn't just find Karen, they also sent me resources and even a small grant to help restore what was lost. That money meant I could rebuild my garden bigger and better than before. I designed new raised beds, added more native plants, and even built a small archway with vines that my daughter could run under. Each weekend became a family project, and neighbors began stopping by to help. People who had once been quiet in fear of HOA retaliation now offered seeds, soil, and even extra tools. It wasn't just about gardening anymore, it was about taking back our sense of community. Karen, of course, hated every moment of it. From her window she watched as my yard came back to life. Every new plant we placed in the soil seemed to tighten the knot in her jaw. She made a few attempts to reassert control. One afternoon, she marched down the sidewalk, holding a clipboard like a weapon, insisting that my new archway violated height restrictions. Another day, she snapped pictures of the wildflowers, muttering about unauthorized vegetation. But the state's ruling had stripped her authority over my garden completely. Whenever she sent me one of her snide little notices, I taped the state's certification letter to my door as a response. The message was clear. Her power ended at the property line. As the weeks rolled into months, her downfall deepened. The state fine wasn't a one-time sting, it was substantial, with penalties for every day she failed to comply with the order to restore what she destroyed. Contractors were expensive, and the HOA board refused to pay for her mistake. It was her name on the violation, not theirs. Rumors swirled that she had drained part of her savings just to cover the initial payment. The same woman who fined others for leaving a flower pot in the wrong place was now on the hook for thousands of dollars because she couldn't stand seeing a garden she didn't control. One evening, as I was finishing up some weeding, Karen finally snapped. She marched right into my yard, something she had done many times before, but this time with desperation in her eyes rather than arrogance. "This is your fault," she hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? You've ruined my reputation. You've destroyed everything I worked for." I stood up, brushed the dirt from my hands, and looked her squarely in the eye. "I didn't ruin anything, Karen. You did this to yourself. You thought you were above the rules, but the rules caught up to you." Her face twisted, torn between fury and fear. She wanted to scream, to argue, but she knew she had no ground left to stand on. For once, I didn't feel anger toward her. I just felt a strange pity. She had built her entire identity around control, and now, with it slipping away, she was left with nothing but bitterness. She stomped away, muttering about lawsuits and appeals, but I knew her threats were empty. The law was clear, and she had no leverage. Over the next year, my garden flourished. The wildflowers attracted bees and butterflies, the vegetables grew in abundance, and the archway turned into a green tunnel that my daughter loved to run through. Neighbors often stopped by to admire it, and sometimes I even shared baskets of fresh tomatoes or cucumbers with them. What started as one person's dream had grown into something that brought joy to many. It wasn't just my victory, it was a reminder to everyone that individuality in nature had a place, even in a neighborhood bound by rules. As for Karen, she faded into the background. She remained HOA president for a while, but her influence was shattered. People voted against her proposals, challenged her decisions, and stopped following her petty rules. Eventually, the board quietly replaced her with someone more reasonable. When I saw the moving truck outside her house months later, I wasn't surprised. She left without saying goodbye. Her reign finally ended. On the day we planted the last row of flowers in the rebuilt garden, my daughter placed a small sign in the soil. It read, "Certified Pollinator Habitat Protected by State Law." She beamed with pride, and I couldn't help but smile. That garden wasn't just dirt and plants anymore, it was a symbol of resilience. Karen had tried to tear it down, but all she did was help us grow stronger. And in that moment, I realized something. Sometimes justice doesn't come with loud confrontations or revenge. Sometimes it comes quietly in the form of a letter in the mail, or in the way neighbors rally together, or in the sight of sunflowers blooming brighter than ever. The fight was over. The garden had won. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Bright Reality for more powerful real-life stories brought to life. Stay tuned because the truth always blooms in the end.